First time that feminism is mentioned in writing was in the late 19th century, and this was a time when women's lives were changing, where particularly for middle class women they were being able to take up certain jobs and have certain levels of independence that they'd never had before, this was something where they also began to develop ideas about women's emancipation, about, to a certain extent, ideas about free love, the idea of women having the right to education, all of those different sorts of things. But even though the word feminism wasn't used till the late 19th century, you can look at these ideas going back another sort of 100 years, really, and particularly around the ideas of the French Revolution and the period of what was called the Enlightenment. And when you talk about that, the famous woman in this country identified with that was, of course, Mary Wollstonecraft, who's very much taken up today as a kind of representative of official, if you like, mainstream bourgeois feminism, but actually was a very, very radical woman for her time. She had child outside of marriage, which was a huge scandal at the time, and after her very sad early death in childbirth of another child, she was, there was a whole load of gossip and nasty stuff about her, which sort of stopped her from being regarded as a serious figure at the time. It was only later that she got that reputation, but she was a very influential woman. She had very independent woman, very influenced by the ideas of the French Revolution. Indeed, she went to France and lived there, and she's perhaps the earliest person we can talk about who develops this kind of theory of women's oppression and the ideas of feminism, and the fact that women's inequality in society is so obvious and so crucial in terms of trying to change society. You have to look at what is happening to women, and those ideas were picked up at various points in the 19th century by what were called the utopian socialists, who also had very radical ideas about women, believed women should be equal, believed women shouldn't be constrained by marriage and conventional ideas, and also, of course, by Marx and Engels themselves, who in the 1840s, when they wrote the Communist Manifesto, were extremely scathing about bourgeois marriage, as they called it, were extremely scathing about the idea that people had to live in these narrow, constrained, supposedly respectable relationships. And indeed, Marx wrote a little book about suicides among middle class and upper class women, and he actually talked about the way in which they were, the way in which hidden within the bourgeois family was sexual abuse, was all sorts of terrible oppression that went on. So there was this tradition that goes back, and obviously, therefore, the ideas of socialism and feminism are linked, and I would argue that you can't have any kind of socialist revolution without women's liberation, and you can't have women's liberation, conversely, without socialist revolution, that the two things are very, very much entwined. Many feminists obviously disagree with this. I mean, if you look at what's generally known as the first wave feminism, which I don't really like this, the description of feminism as waves. I think it's a kind of, a sort of slightly weird way of looking at it. But anyway, if you accept that terminology, the first wave kind of comes off the back of the late 19th century and is to do with people developing these radical intellectual ideas, but also a growth of women taking action over all sorts of different things, big waves of strikes. Obviously, very famously, the match-women's strike in 1888, which started off the struggle for the new unions in the East End of London, but also in the period before the First World War, lots of women going on strike in previously unorganised workplaces as well as men. And of course the biggest struggle then was the one for suffrage, for the vote for women. And this was kind of an international struggle. It was a situation where in different countries obviously people achieved the vote at different times. I mean, for example, in France, women didn't get the vote till 1945, after the Second World War. In Britain, some women got the vote in 1918, after the First World War, but these were the result of big struggles in the United States, across Europe, in Germany, in Russia and so on, not just about the suffrage, but about a range of, if you like, political demands for women to have the right to do certain things, to work or to have education. And of course, again, there was no real access for women to go into higher education until around the time of the beginning of the 20th century, when that began to change. So they couldn't get full degrees, they weren't allowed into a number of universities. The Oxford and Cambridge women's colleges were only developed at the end of the 19th century. So all these kind of demands were demands for, not for economic change in itself, but for political change, and obviously in that sense reflected the demands and the aspirations, certainly of working class women as well, but actually in practice these were demands which were likely to be fulfilled, and indeed was the case with suffrage in this country, only for a minority of women at least to start with. So that was, I suppose, the earliest manifestation of a mass feminist movement, and it was one which even at that time brought quite sharp arguments, which I'll come on to a little bit later, between the socialists and the Marxists of the time and the more middle class, or what sometimes are called bourgeois feminists. I mean, that's a term which doesn't just, in this context, doesn't just mean the very just the ruling class women. It also means women who accept very much the sort of single issue aspirations of a minority of women, or at least that's how I understand it. So those movements, which had some success, but of course it became clear in the years after the First World War, and indeed running up to and after the Second World War, that women's position in society was very subordinate to that of men. And this was true across classes, it was true in all sorts of different areas of life. It was true in this country, for example, you couldn't buy a house with a mortgage up till until the early 1970s. You couldn't sign what was called a hire purchase agreement without getting the permission of your father or your husband or some man who could guarantee that your money was financially sound. You couldn't do any of those sorts of things. You obviously, women didn't have the same access to various careers, to higher education as to men. That began to change in the 50s in this country, and more rapidly in the 1960s. And the place where it changed most spectacularly was in the United States, which in any case was quite advanced sort of sexually, education-wise, compared to Europe by the interwar years. You know, there was a lot more sort of open sexual relationships and so on, and more access to higher education than there was in Europe. But that changed even more after the Second World War in the 50s and 60s. But also in the 60s you had some very profound radical movements which shook America. You know, I had the Civil Rights Movement, which had huge involvement of both black and white women in the Civil Rights Movement in the south of the United States in the 50s and 60s. Very important contribution to them. There was the anti-Vietnam War movement, which women played less of a role in, but no less opposition to it. But it was based on, a lot of it was based on opposing the draft, opposing conscription, which obviously women weren't conscripted, so it was centred on men, but women were as opposed to the war as men were or young women were in general. There was the student movement, which again, very many women contributed to. And the women's liberation movement, what's called second wave feminism now, sort of sprang out of those movements in the United States in a very dramatic and a very divided fashion, because the women in those movements found that, I don't have time to go into it in this talk, but were treated absolutely abominably by the men. I mean, really shocking stuff when you read it. You know, that they're just insulted. They're literally told you've got to go and make the tea. They are people who are just not treated as equals in most ways, even though they are doing all sorts of things which, well, they shouldn't be treated like that anyway, but are doing all sorts of very valuable political work. But it's regarded that it's the men who will make the speeches and all this sort of thing. And that eventually blew up at a conference for the New Politics, when a woman called Shulamith Firestone, who's a well-known feminist, tried to get up and move a resolution and was told to sit down, little girl, we've got more important things to talk about than women's liberation. And this was at a time when they were discussing the rights of what we now call the Native Americans, the American Indians as they called them at the time. So the kind of irony was not lost on the women who felt that everybody gets a look in about their own oppression apart from women. And that led to a very, very big split in the movement and the establishment of what was a mass women's liberation movement in the United States. It wasn't anywhere else, but in the United States it was. You know, it involved hundreds of thousands of women and was very, very big. In Britain, it was smaller. It wasn't as acrimonious because we hadn't gone through all these kind of movements, and it was much more tied to the left and to the trade unions than had been the case in the United States for reasons to do with McCarthyism and all sorts of other things. But anyway, it had a big impact in the late 60s, early 70s in this country as well. In both countries, you've got a flourishing of lots and lots of books and writing on women's liberation. I mean, Sheila Rowbottom wrote, I think, still some of her best writings in 2 or 3, well, it probably took her longer than 2 or 3 years, but published in 2 or 3 years in the early 70s on history, women's history, which is still very influential. But if you look at Firestone, if you look at Germaine Greer, if you look at loads and loads of women who wrote very serious work on these different things. However, that movement too splintered and divided by the late 70s, and it divided between kind of socialist feminists and radical feminists, as they were called, so women who rejected involvement with men. And there were divisions then over things like some of these women, the radical feminists, didn't want boy children in the creches, for example. They thought that was something they couldn't accept. There was big arguments over things like domestic violence, rape, pornography, which the radical feminists saw as much more central rather than the socialist and Marxist feminists who saw economic oppression and exploitation as key to things. So that was a split that happened. What then developed, I suppose you could talk about, as it is often talked about in academia, as the sort of mainstreaming of feminism that becomes acceptable quite early on. I mean, by the mid-70s, the United Nations are taking up the idea that women are unequal and that we have to do something about it, had conferences and so on. So by the time you get to more modern feminism, what's sometimes called third or fourth wave feminism, which I think has nothing of the significance of first or second, to be honest. I think it's much more marginal to the whole process. But of course, what you've got on the one hand is already the kind of mainstreaming of feminism, but you've also got women who are much more likely to be educated and have more opportunities than previous generations, but also feel themselves a bit more precarious in terms of jobs and conditions and all these kind of things. Now, that too, when you look at third wave feminism, you look at it in terms of, it's very much to do with individual ways of approaching. It's not true that everybody in third wave feminism just thinks we should just treat this individually, but there's a lot of identity politics to it, there's a lot of personal development, there's a lot of ideas which actually aren't more widely connected with women's liberation. And I think part of the problems for all of these movements is that they come up against a system which is completely oppressive of women. I mean, I'm sure I don't need to explain this to this audience, but women are systematically exploited and oppressed to a greater extent than men are. I mean, you know, if you can look in terms of wages, the sorts of jobs that women do, the whole question of violence and sexual objectification, on and on. You know, every area you look at women's health, or you look at anything you care to look at, who gets the worst housing, who gets the worst deal with all of these things, you find it's women. And of course you then have to think, well, how can you deal with this question of women's oppression? And this is, I think, the weakness of the various feminist movements, which obviously differ quite a lot from one another, is that they don't tend to look at how you can overcome this oppressive system. They look very much at what you can achieve as women within those systems, rather than what you can do outside of it. And therefore, I think you now have a sort of fragmentation of feminism, where you have bourgeois feminism at the top of society. You know, there's a massive I mean, we now have a female Archbishop of Canterbury. We now have, if you look at, well, we have, apart from in the Labour Party, we do have women party leaders, which hasn't yet got through to Labour, but no doubt will at some point in the 22nd century or whenever it is. But you now do have women who are presidents, who are prime ministers, who play this kind of role. So you've got women at the top of society, not to the same extent as men, still facing all sorts of oppression in order to get there, but nonetheless accepted. There's a certain acceptance of feminism at that level. At the other end of society, things have definitely got worse for women. I mean, I think that women are now facing an incredible, I mean, we've always talked about the double burden of work and home, but if you think about the whole caring crisis now and what that means for women, both in terms of caring for older people, caring for children, when you think what it means in terms of jobs, where women often do 2 or sometimes 3 jobs in order to manage to survive, when you think about the conditions under which women work, and men work as well, but women again tend to be in worse positions, then you're talking about a very, very sharp division, between women, not just women against men, but women of one class against women of another class. And I think we're seeing this more clearly now than we have done for some time. And I think that class division is so important to understanding it. And I want to quote a little bit from Alexandra Kollontai, who was, again, as I'm sure people know, was a Russian revolutionary who after the revolution led the Janotdel, which was the women's department. The Russian revolutionaries understood that women had such a lousy deal in Russia, and particularly millions of them were peasants who were not just working very hard, but under terrible conditions in relation to the family and the church and all these other kind of things. And there also was bourgeois feminism in Russia, and Kollontai, before the revolution, before the First World War, there was a big battle between the bourgeois feminists and the Marxist feminists. And she wrote around that time, she says, political equality is a means of sharing with the men of their class the class privileges and benefits of life that currently are exclusively enjoyed by the latter. More accurately, it is a way to consolidate the advantages that currently are the exclusive province of the men of the bourgeoisie. Where for proletarian women, for working class women, political rights are merely a tool in the struggle with the existing capitalist system, for bourgeois women, on the other hand, they are a new way of affirming their class dominance. In other words, they want to be inside what is an exploitative ruling class or middle class. And she says this is even true of feminists who call themselves socialists or who see themselves as liberal or so on. She says, while declaring themselves supporters of social reforms and even of socialism in an immeasurably distant future, of course, the feminists do not intend to fight in the ranks of the working class in order to realise this coveted objective of the proletariat. Now, when you think of these Labour women MPs, for example, I think they exactly fit this sort of description, that they're very keen on the idea of equality in the abstract and in the long term, but when it comes to what are we doing about public spending cuts, do we want to spend more money on weapons rather than on welfare, you see exactly where their priorities lie. So I think for us as Marxists, there's obviously, I think there's a lot that we have in common with feminism in terms of identification of the oppression of women and the need to fight against the oppression of women. And there are many campaigns, obviously, we're all involved in, which are where we're involved with feminists. But it's also true that there is a class division, which means that when we look at how we achieve women's liberation, when we look at how we overcome the inequalities of class society, we have to look at class struggle against the men and the women of the ruling class who at present control the wealth and control the power in this country. And I think that's what I wanted to kind of lead on to, and hopefully we can have a discussion about what that means in practice.